Chapter 27 of Barnaby Rudge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens. Chapter 27. Mr. Haredale stood in the widow's parlour with the door key in his hand, gazing by turns at Mr. Chester and at Gabriel Varden, and occasionally glancing downward at the key, as in the hope that of its own accord it would unlock the mystery, until Mr. Chester, putting on his hat and gloves, and sweetly inquiring whether they were walking in the same direction, recalled him to himself. "No," he said, "our roads diverge, widely, as you know. For the present I shall remain here." "You will be hipped, Haredale. You will be miserable, melancholy, utterly wretched," returned the other. "It's a place of the very last description for a man of your temper. I know it will make you very miserable." "Let it," said Mr. Haredale, sitting down, "and thrive upon the thought. Good night." Feigning to be wholly unconscious of the abrupt wave of the hand which rendered this farewell tantamount to a dismissal, Mr. Chester retorted with a bland and heartfelt benediction, and inquired of Gabriel in what direction he was going. "Yours, sir, would be too much honour for the like of me," replied the locksmith, hesitating. "I wish you to remain here a little while, Varden," said Mr. Haredale, without looking towards them. "I have a word or two to say to you." "I will not intrude upon your conference another moment," said Mr. Chester, with inconceivable politeness. "May it be satisfactory to you both. God bless you." So saying, and bestowing upon the locksmith a most refulgent smile, he left them. "A deplorably constituted creature, that rugged person," he said, as he walked along the street. "He is an atrocity that carries its own punishment along with it, a bear that gnaws himself. And here is one of the inestimable advantages of having a perfect command over one's inclinations. I have been tempted in these 2 short interviews to draw upon that fellow 50 times. 5 men in 6 would have yielded to the impulse. By suppressing mine I wound him deeper and more keenly than if I were the best swordsman in all Europe, and he the worst. You are the wise man's very last resource," he said, tapping the hilt of his weapon. "We can but appeal to you when all else is said and done. To come to you before, and thereby spare our adversaries so much, is a barbarian mode of warfare, quite unworthy of any man with the remotest pretensions to delicacy of feeling or refinement." He smiled so very pleasantly as he communed with himself after this manner, that a beggar was emboldened to follow for alms, and to dog his footsteps for some distance. He was gratified by the circumstance, feeling it complimentary to his power of feature, and as a reward suffered the man to follow him until he called a chair, when he graciously dismissed him with a fervent blessing. "Which is as easy as cursing," he wisely added as he took his seat, "and more becoming to the face. To Clerkenwell, my good creatures, if you please." The chairmen were rendered quite vivacious by having such a courteous burden, and to Clerkenwell they went at a fair round trot. Alighting at a certain point he had indicated to them upon the road, and paying them something less than they expected from a fare of such gentle speech, he turned into the street in which the locksmith dwelt, and presently stood beneath the shadow of the Golden Key. Mr. Tappertit, who was hard at work by lamplight in a corner of the workshop, remained unconscious of his presence until a hand upon his shoulder made him start and turn his head. "Industry," said Mr. Chester, "is the soul of business and the keystone of prosperity. Mr. Tappertit, I shall expect you to invite me to dinner when you are Lord Mayor of London." "Sir," returned the 'prentice, laying down his hammer and rubbing his nose on the back of a very sooty hand, "I scorn the Lord Mayor and everything that belongs to him. We must have another state of society, sir, before you catch me being Lord Mayor. How d'ye do, sir?" "The better, Mr. Tappertit, for looking into your ingenuous face once more. I hope you are well." "I am as well, sir," said Sim, standing up to get nearer to his ear, and whispering hoarsely, "as any man can be under the aggrawations to which I am exposed. My life's a burden to me. If it wasn't for wengeance I'd play at pitch and toss with it on the losing hazard." "Is Mrs. Varden at home?" said Mr. Chester. "Sir," returned Sim, eyeing him over with a look of concentrated expression, "she is. Did you wish to see her?" Mr. Chester nodded. "Then come this way, sir," said Sim, wiping his face upon his apron. "Follow me, sir. Would you permit me to whisper in your ear 1/2 a second?" "By all means." Mr. Tappertit raised himself on tiptoe, applied his lips to Mr. Chester's ear, drew back his head without saying anything, looked hard at him, applied them to his ear again, again drew back, and finally whispered, "The name is Joseph Willet. Hush! I say no more." Having said that much, he beckoned the visitor with a mysterious aspect to follow him to the parlour door, where he announced him in the voice of a gentleman usher. "Mr. Chester. And not Mr. Eddard, mind," said Sim, looking into the door again, and adding this by way of postscript in his own person. "It's his father." "But do not let his father," said Mr. Chester, advancing hat in hand, as he observed the effect of this last explanatory announcement, "do not let his father be any check or restraint on your domestic occupations, Miss Varden." "Oh, now, there! An't I always a saying it?" exclaimed Miggs, clapping her hands. "If he ain't been and took missus for her own daughter! Well, she do look like it, that she do. Only think of that, Mim!" "Is it possible," said Mr. Chester in his softest tones, "that this is Mrs. Varden? I am amazed. That is not your daughter, Mrs. Varden? No, no, your sister?" "My daughter indeed, sir," returned Mrs. V., blushing with great juvenility. "Ah, Mrs. Varden," cried the visitor. "Ah, ma'am, humanity is indeed a happy lot, when we can repeat ourselves in others and still be young as they. You must allow me to salute you, the custom of the country, my dear madam. Your daughter too." Dolly showed some reluctance to perform this ceremony, but was sharply reproved by Mrs. Varden, who insisted on her undergoing it that minute. For pride, she said with great severity, was one of the 7 deadly sins, and humility and lowliness of heart were virtues. Wherefore she desired that Dolly would be kissed immediately on pain of her just displeasure, at the same time giving her to understand that whatever she saw her mother do she might safely do herself, without being at the trouble of any reasoning or reflection on the subject, which indeed was offensive and undutiful, and in direct contravention of the Church Catechism. Thus admonished, Dolly complied, though by no means willingly, for there was a broad, bold look of admiration in Mr. Chester's face, refined and polished though it sought to be, which distressed her very much. As she stood with downcast eyes, not liking to look up and meet his, he gazed upon her with an approving air, and then turned to her mother. "My friend Gabriel, whose acquaintance I only made this very evening, should be a happy man, Mrs. Varden." "Ah," sighed Mrs. V., shaking her head. "Ah," echoed Miggs. "Is that the case?" said Mr. Chester compassionately. "Dear me!" "Master has no intentions, sir," murmured Miggs as she sidled up to him, "but to be as grateful as his nater will let him for everythink he owns which it is in his powers to appreciate." "But we never, sir," said Miggs, looking sideways at Mrs. Varden, and interlarding her discourse with a sigh, "we never know the full value of some wines and fig trees till we lose 'em. So much the worse, sir, for them as has the slighting of 'em on their consciences when they're gone to be in full blow elsewhere." And Miss Miggs cast up her eyes to signify where that might be. As Mrs. Varden distinctly heard, and was intended to hear, all that Miggs said, and as these words appeared to convey in metaphorical terms a presage or foreboding that she would at some early period droop beneath her trials and take an easy flight towards the stars, she immediately began to languish, and taking a volume of the manual from a neighbouring table, leant her arm upon it as though she were hope and that her anchor. Mr. Chester, perceiving this, and seeing how the volume was lettered on the back, took it gently from her hand and turned the fluttering leaves. "My favourite book, dear madam. How often, how very often, in his early life, before he can remember," this clause was strictly true, "have I deduced little easy moral lessons from its pages, for my dear son Ned. You know Ned?" Mrs. Varden had that honour, and a fine affable young gentleman he was. "You're a mother, Mrs. Varden," said Mr. Chester, taking a pinch of snuff, "and you know what I as a father feel when he is praised. He gives me some uneasiness, much uneasiness. He's of a roving nature, ma'am, From flower to flower, from sweet